the force incarnate. In English, words of Latin origin tend to carry overtones of intellectual, moral, and aesthetic classiness. Overtones which are not carried, as a rule, by their Anglo-Saxon equivalents. Maternal, for instance, means the same as motherly, intoxicated as drunk, but with what subtly important shades of difference. And when Shakespeare needed a name for a comic character, it was Sir Toby Belch that he chose, not Cavalier Tobias Eructation. The word personality is derived from the Latin, and its upper partials are in the highest degree respectable. For some odd philological reason, the Saxon equivalent of personality is hardly ever used, which is a pity. For if it were used as currently as belch is used for eructation, would people make such a reverential fuss about the thing connoted as certain English-speaking philosophers, moralists, and theologians have recently made? Personality, we are constantly being assured, is the highest form of reality with which we are acquainted. But surely people would think twice about making or accepting this affirmation if, instead of personality, the word employed had been its Teutonic synonym, selfness. For the word selfness, though it means precisely the same, carries none of the high-class overtones that go with the word personality. On the contrary, its primary meaning means to us embedded, as it were, in discords, like the note of a cracked bell. For as all exponents of the perennial philosophy of the Jedi have constantly insisted, man's obsessive consciousness of, and insistence on being a separate self, is the final and most formidable obstacle to unitive knowledge of the Force. To be a self is, for a Jedi, the original sin, and to die to self, in feeling, will, and intellect, is the final and all-inclusive virtue. It is the memory of these utterances that calls up the unfavourable overtones with which the word selfness is associated. The all too favourable overtones of the word personality are evoked in part by its intrinsically solemn Latinity, but also by having nothing in common with the flesh and blood persons of our everyday acquaintance. Nothing, that is to say, except that indwelling spirit with which we ought and are intended to identify ourselves, but which most of us prefer to ignore in favour of our separate selfness. This force eclipsing and anti-spiritual selfness should have been given the same name as applied to the force, which is spirit, is, to say the least of it, unfortunate. Like all such mistakes, it is probably, in some obscure and subconscious way, voluntary and purposeful. We love our selfness. We want to be justified in our love. Therefore, we christen it with the same name as applied by Christian theologians to Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Quote. But now you ask me how you may destroy this naked knowing and feeling of your own being. For perhaps you think that if it were destroyed, all other hindrances would be destroyed, and if you think this, you think correctly. But to this I answer, and I say, without a full special grace freely given by the Force, and also a full acceptance on your part to receive such grace, this naked knowing and feeling of your being may in no way be destroyed. And this fact is nothing else but a strong and deep ghostly sorrow. All people experience sorrow, and they feel a special sorrow towards themselves. All other sorrows in comparison to this be but, as it were, performative. For you sorrow earnestly in the knowledge and feeling of what you are, but also that you are. And who never feels this sorrow, let them feel sorrow, for they have never felt perfect sorrow. This sorrow, when it is experienced, cleanses the psyche, not only of sin, but also of the pain that it has deserved for sin. And also it makes a psyche able to receive that joy which radiates from a person all-knowing and feeling of their being. This sorrow, if it be truly felt, is full of holy desire. Otherwise, a person might never in this life accept it or bear it. For if a psyche were not somewhat fed with comfort caused by sorrow, it should not be able to bear the pain caused by the knowing and feeling of its being. For as often as the psyche would have a true knowing and a feeling of the force in purity of spirit, as it may be here, it often knows and feels only a foul stinking lump of itself, which must always be hated and despised and forsaken, if it should be a perfect disciple of the force, taught by it in mount of perfection. So often the psyche goes nigh mad for sorrow. Every psyche must have this sorrow and this desire and feel in itself, either in this manner or in another, as the force is revealed, to teach its ghostly disciples according to its good will and their according ableness in body and in psyche, in degree and disposition, here the time be that they may perfectly be won into the force in perfect charity such as may be had here, if the force is revealed. The cloud of unknowing.
End quote.
What is the nature of this stinking lump of selfness or personality, which has to be so passionately repented of and so completely died to, before there can be any true knowing of the force in purity of spirit? The most meagre and non-committal hypothesis is that of Hume. Mankind, he says, are nothing but a bundle or a collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. An almost identical answer is given by the Buddhists, whose doctrine of anatta is the denial of any permanent psyche existing behind the flux of experience and the various psychophysical skandhas, closely corresponding to Hume's bundles, which constitute the more enduring elements of personality. Hume and the Buddhists give a sufficiently realistic description of selfness in action, but they fail to explain how or why the bundles ever become bundles. Did their constituent atoms of experience come together of their own accord? And if so, why, or by what means, and within what kind of non-spatial universe? To give a plausible answer to the questions in terms of anatta is so difficult that we are forced to abandon the doctrine in favour of the notion that behind the flux and within the bundles there exists some kind of permanent psyche by which experience is organised and which in turn makes use of that organised experience to become a particular and unique personality. This is the view of orthodox Hinduism, from which Buddhism thought parted company, and of almost all European thought from before the time of Aristotle to the present day. But whereas most contemporary thinkers make an attempt to describe human nature in terms of a dichotomy of interacting psyche and physique, or an inseparable wholeness of these two elements within particular embodied selves, all the exponents of the perennial philosophy of the Jedi make, in one form or another, the affirmation that humans are a kind of trinity, composed of body, psyche, and spirit. Selfness, or personality, is a product of the first two elements. The third element, that quid increatum et increable, as Eckhart called it, is akin to, or even identical with, the divine spirit that is the ground of all being and which we know as the Force. Humanity's final end, the purpose of its existence, is to love, know, and be united with the immanent and transcendent unmanifest force. And this identification of self with spiritual not self can be achieved only by dying to selfness and living to spirit.
Quote.
What could begin to deny self if there were not something in humanity different from self? William Law. What is person? An angel, an animal, a void, a world, a nothing surrounded by the force, indigent of the force, capable of the force, filled with the force, if it so desires. Birul. The separate creaturely life, as opposed to life in union with the Force, is only a life of various appetites, hungers, and wants, and cannot possibly be anything else. The Force cannot make a creature to be in itself, or in its own nature, anything else but a state of emptiness. The highest life that is natural and creaturely can go no higher than this. It can only be a bare capacity for goodness, and cannot possibly be a good and happy life, but by the life of the Force dwelling in and in union with it. And this is the twofold life that, of all necessity, must be united in every good and perfect and happy creature. William Law. The scriptures say of human beings that there is an outward person, and along with it an inner person. To the outward person belong those things that depend on the psyche, but are connected with the flesh and are blended with it, and the cooperative functions of the several members, such as the eye, the ear, the tongue, the hand, and so on. The scripture speaks of all this as the older person, the earthy person, the outward person, the enemy, the servant. Within us all is the other person, the inner person, whom the scripture calls the new person, the heavenly person, the young person, the friend, the noble person, the Jedi. The seed of the Force is in us. Given an intelligent and hard-working farmer, it will thrive and grow into the Force, whose seed it is, and accordingly its fruits will be of a Force nature. Pear seeds grow into pear trees, nut seeds into nut trees, and the Force seeds into the Force. Eckhart.
End quote.
The will is free, and we are at liberty to identify our being either exclusively with our selfness and its interests, regarded as independent of indwelling spirit and the transcendent unmanifest force, in which case we shall be passively damned or actively fiendish, or exclusively with the divine within us and without, in which case we shall be Jedi, or finally with self at one moment or in one context, and with spiritual not self at other moments and in other contexts, in which case we shall be average citizens, too theocentric to be wholly lost, and too egocentric to achieve enlightenment and total deliverance. Since human craving can never be satisfied except by the unitive knowledge with the Force, and since the mind-body is capable of an enormous variety of experiences, we are free to identify ourselves with an almost infinite number of possible objects, with the pleasures of gluttony, for example, or intemperance, or sensuality, with money, power, or fame, with our family, regarded as a possession or actually an extension and projection of our own selfness, with our goods and chattels, our hobbies, our collections, with our artistic or scientific talents, with some favourite branch of knowledge, some fascinating special subject, with our professions, our political parties, our churches, with our memories of success or misfortune, our hopes, fears, and schemes for the future, and finally, with the eternal reality within which and by which all the rest has its being. And we are free, of course, to identify ourselves with more than one of these things simultaneously or in succession. Hence, the quite astonishingly improbable combinations of traits making up a complex personality. Thus, a person can be at once the craftiest of politicians and the dupe of his own verbiage, can have a passion for brandy and money, and an equal passion for the poetry of George Meredith, and sexual partners and their own mother, for horse racing and detective stories, and the good of their country, the whole accompanied by a sneaking fear of hellfire, a hatred of Spinoza, and an unblemished record for Sunday church-going. A person born with one kind of psychophysical constitution will be tempted to identify themselves with one set of interests and passions, while a person with another kind of temperament will be tempted to make very different identifications. But these temptations, though extremely powerful if the constitutional bias is strongly marked, do not have to be succumbed to. People can and do resist them, can and do refuse to identify themselves with that what it would be all too easy and natural for them to be, can and do become better and quite other than their own selves. In this context, the following brief article on How People Behave in a Crisis, published in a recent issue of Harper's Magazine, is highly significant. A young psychiatrist who went as a medical observer on 5 combat missions of the 8th Air Force in England says that in times of great stress and danger, people are likely to react quite uniformly, even though under normal circumstances they differ widely in personality. He went on one mission during which the 617 plane and crew were so severely damaged that survival seemed impossible. He had already studied the on-the-ground personalities of the crew and had found that they represented a great diversity of human types. Of their behaviour in crisis, he reported thus: their reactions were remarkably alike. During the violent combat and in the acute emergencies that arose during it, they were all quietly precise in the interphone and decisive in action. The tail gunner, right waist gunner, and navigator were severely wounded early in the fight, but all 3 kept at their duties efficiently and without cessation. The burden of emergency work fell on the pilot, engineer, and bull turret gunner, and all functioned with rapidity, skillful effectiveness, and no lost motion. The burden of the decisions during, but particularly after the combat, rested essentially on the pilot, and in secondary details on the co-pilot and the bombardier. The decisions arrived at with care and speed were unquestioned once they were made and proved excellent. In the period when disaster was momentarily expected, the alternative plans of action were made clearly and with no thought other than the safety of the entire crew. All at this point were quiet, unobtrusively cheerful, and ready for anything. There was at no time paralysis, panic, unclear thinking, faulty or confused judgment, or self-seeking in any one of them. One could not possibly have inferred from their behaviour that one was a person of unstable moods, and that one was a shy, quiet, and introspective. They all became outwardly calm, precise in thought, and rapid in action. Such action is typical of a crew who know intimately what fear is, so that they can use, without being distracted by, its physiological concomitants, who are well trained, so that they can direct their action with clarity, and who all have more than personal trust inherent in a unified team. We see then that when the crisis came, each of these young people forgot the particular personality which they had built up out of the elements provided by their heredity and their environment in which they had grown up. That one resisted the normally irresistible temptation to identify themselves with their mood of the moment. Another, the temptation to identify themselves with their private daydreams, and so on with the rest. And that all of them behaved in the same strikingly similar and wholly admirable way. It was as though the crisis and the preliminary training for crisis had lifted them out of their divergent personalities and raised them to the same higher level. Sometimes, crisis alone, without any preparatory training, is sufficient to make people forget to be their customary selves and become, for the time being, something quite different. Thus, the most unlikely people will, under the influence of disaster, temporarily turn into heroes, martyrs, selfless labourers for the good of their fellows. Very often, too, the proximity of death produces similar results. For example, Samuel Johnson behaved in one way during almost the whole of his life, and in quite another way during his last illness. The fascinatingly complex personality, in which 6 generations of Boswellians have taken so much delight, the learned, bore and glutton, the kind-hearted bully, the superstitious intellectual, the convinced Christian who was a fetishist, the courageous man who was terrified of death, became, while he was actually dying, simple, single, serene, and force-centered. Paradoxical as it may seem, it is for very many persons much easier to behave selflessly in time of crisis than it is when life is taking its normal course in relatively undisturbed tranquility. When the going is easy, there is nothing to make us forget our precious selfness, nothing except our own will to mortification and knowledge of the force, to distract our minds from the distractions with which we have chosen to be identified. We are at perfect liberty to wallow in our personality to our heart's content. And how we wallow. It is for this reason that all the masters of the spiritual life insist so strongly upon the importance of little things.
Quote.
The force requires a faithful fulfillment of the merest trifle given us to do, rather than the most ardent aspiration to things to which we are not called. Saint François de Sales. There is no one in the world who cannot arrive without difficulty at the most eminent perfection by fulfilling with love obscure their common duties. J.P. de Caussade. Some people measure the worth of good actions only by their natural qualities or their difficulty, giving the preference to what is conspicuous or brilliant. Such men forget that Christian values, which are inspirations from the force, should be viewed from the side of grace, not that of nature. The dignity and difficulty of a good action certainly affects what is technically called its accidental worth, but all its essential worth comes from love alone. Jean-Pierre Camus, quoting Saint François de Sales.
End quote.
The Jedi is one who knows that every moment of our human life is a moment of crisis. For at every moment, we are called upon to make an all-important decision, to choose between the way that leads to death and spiritual darkness and the way that leads towards light and life, between interests exclusively temporal and the eternal order, between our personal will or the will of some projection of our personality and the will of the force. In order to fit themselves to deal with the emergencies of their way of life, the Jedi undertakes appropriate training of mind and body, just as the soldier does. But whereas the objectives of military training are limited and very simple, namely to make people courageous, cool-headed, and cooperatively efficient in the business of killing other people, with whom personally they have no quarrel, the objectives of spiritual training are much less narrowly specialized. Here, the aim is primarily to make human beings to a state in which, because they are no longer any force-eclipsing obstacles between themselves and reality, they are able to be aware continuously of the divine force of their own and all other beings. Secondarily, as a means to this end, to meet all, even the most trivial circumstances of daily living, without malice, greed, self-assertion, or voluntary ignorance, but consistently with love and understanding. Because, for the lover of the force, every moment is a moment of crisis. Spiritual training is incomparably more difficult and searching than military training. There are many good soldiers. There are few Jedi. We've seen that in critical emergencies, soldiers specifically trained to cope with that kind of thing tend to forget the inborn and acquired idiosyncrasies with which they would normally identify their being, and, transcending selfness, to behave in the same, one-pointed, better than personal way. What is true of soldiers is also true of Jedi, but with this important difference, that the aim of spiritual training is to make people become selfless in every circumstance of life, while the aim of military training is to make them selfless only in certain very special circumstances and in relation to only certain classes of human beings. This could not be otherwise, for all that we are and will and do depends, in the last analysis, upon what we believe the nature of things to be. The philosophy that rationalizes power politics and justifies war and military training is always, whatever the official religion of the politicians and warmakers, some wildly unrealistic doctrine of national, racial, or ideological idolatry, having as its inevitable corollaries the notions of heronfolk and the lesser breeds without the law. The biographies of the Jedi testify unequivocally to the fact that spiritual training leads to a transcendence of personality, not merely in the special circumstances of battle, but in all circumstances and in relation to all creatures, so that the Jedi loves their enemies, or if they are a Buddhist, does not even recognize the existence of enemies, but treats all sentient beings, subhuman as well as human, with the same compassion and disinterested goodwill. Those who win through to the unitive knowledge of the Force set out upon their course from the most diverse starting points. One is a man, another a woman, one a born active, another a born contemplative. No two of them inherit the same temperament and physical constitution, and their lives are passed in material, moral, and intellectual environments that are profoundly dissimilar. Nevertheless, insofar as they are Jedi, insofar as they possess the unitive knowledge that makes them at one with the Force, they are all astonishingly alike. Their actions are uniformly selfless, and they are constantly recollected, so that every moment they know who they are and what is their true relation to the universe and its spiritual ground in the Force. Of even plain average people, it may be said that their name is Legion, much more so of exceptionally complex personalities who identify themselves with a wide diversity of moods, cravings, and opinions. Jedi, on the contrary, are neither double-minded nor half-hearted, but single and, however great their intellectual gifts, profoundly simple. The multiplicity of Legion has given place to one-pointedness, not to any of those evil one-pointednesses of ambition or covetousness, or lust for power and fame, not even to any of the nobler, but still all too human one-pointednesses of art, scholarship and science, regarded as ends in themselves, but to the supreme, more than human one-pointedness that is the very being of those psyches who consciously and consistently pursue humanity's final end, union with the Force. In one of the Pali scriptures, there is a significant anecdote about the Brahmin Drona, who, seeing the Blessed One sitting at the foot of a tree, asked him, "Are you a diva?" And the Exalted One answered, "I am not." "Are you a Gandharva?" "I am not." "Are you a Yaksha?" "I am not." "Are you a man?" "I am not a man." On the Brahmin asking what he might be, the Blessed One replied, "Those evil influences, those cravings, whose non-destruction would have individualized me as a diva, a Gandharva, a Yaksha, or a man, I have completely annihilated. Know therefore that I am Buddha. Here, we may remark in passing that it is only the one-pointed who are truly capable of worshipping one divine identity. Monotheism as a theory can be entertained even by a person whose name is Legion. But when it comes to passing from theory to practice, from discursive knowledge about to immediate acquaintance with the one force, there cannot be monotheism except where there is singleness of heart. Knowledge is in the knower according to the mode of the knower. Where the knower is polypsychic, the universe they know by immediate experience is polytheistic. The Buddha declined to make any statement in regard to the ultimate divine reality. All he would talk about was nirvana, which is the name of the experience that comes to the totally selfless and one-pointed. To this same experience, others have given the name of union with Brahman, with al-Haq, with the immanent and transcendent unmanifest force. Maintaining, in this matter, the attitude of a strict operationalist, the Buddha would speak only of the spiritual experience, not of the metaphysical entity presumed by the theologians of other religions, as also of later Buddhism, to be the object, and, since in contemplation the knower, the known, and the knowledge are all one, at the same time the subject and substance of that experience.
Quote.
When a person lacks discrimination, their will wanders in all directions after innumerable aims. Those who lack discrimination may quote the letter of the scripture, but they are really denying its inner truth. They are full of worldly desires and hungry for the rewards of heaven. They use beautiful figures of speech. They teach elaborate rituals, which are supposed to obtain pleasure and power for those who practice them. But actually, they understand nothing except the law of karma that chains people to rebirth. Those whose discrimination is stolen away by such talk grow deeply attached to pleasures and power, and so they are unable to develop that one-pointed concentration of the will which leads a person to absorption in the force. Bhagavad Gita.
End quote.
Among the cultivated and mentally active, hagiography is now a very unpopular form of literature. This fact is not at all surprising. The cultivated and the mentally active have an insatiable appetite for novelty, diversity, and distraction. But the Jedi, however, commanding their talents and whatever the nature of their professional activities, are all incessantly preoccupied with only one subject: spiritual reality and the means by which they and their fellows can come to the unitive knowledge of that reality in the Force. And as for their actions, these are as monotonously uniform as their thoughts, for in all circumstances they behave selflessly, patiently, and with indefatigable charity. No wonder, then, that the biographies of such men and women remain unread. For one well-educated person who knows anything about William Law, there are 200 or 300 who have read Boswell's life of his younger contemporary. Why? Because until he actually lay dying, Johnson indulged himself in the most fascinating of multiple personalities, whereas Law, for all the superiority of his talents, was almost absurdly simple and single-minded. Legion prefers to read about Legion. It is for this reason that, in the whole repertory of epic, drama, and the novel, there are hardly any representations of true Jedi.
Quote.
O friend, hope for it while you live, know while you live, understand while you live, for in life deliverance abides. If your bonds are not broken whilst living, what hope is there for deliverance in death? It is but an empty dream that the psyche shall have union with it, because the psyche has passed from the body. If it is found now, it is found then. If not, we go to dwell in the city of death. Kabir. This figure, in the form of a sun, represents the will of the Force. The faces placed here in the sun represent psyches living in the divine will. These faces are arranged in 3 concentric circles, showing the 3 degrees of this divine will. The first, or outermost degree, signifies the psyches of the active life. The second, those of the life of contemplation. The third, those of life of supereminence. Outside the first circle are many tools, such as pensers and hammers, denoting the active life. But around the second circle we have placed nothing at all, in order to signify that this is a kind of contemplative life. Without any other speculations or practices, one must follow the leading of the will of the force. The tools are on the ground and in shadow, inasmuch as outward works are in themselves full of darkness. These tools, however, are touched by a ray of the sun, to show that works may be enlightened and illuminated by the will of the force. The light of the divine will shines but little on the faces of the first circle, much more on those of the second, whilst those of the third or innermost circle are resplendent. The features of the first show up most clearly, the second less, the third hardly at all. This signifies that the psyches of the first degree are much in themselves, those of the second degree are less in themselves and more in the force. Those in the third degree are almost nothing in themselves and all in the force, absorbed in its essential will. All these faces have their eyes fixed on the will of the force. Bennett of Canfield.
End quote.
It is by virtue of their absorption in the force, and just because they have not identified their being with the inborn and acquired elements of their private personality, that the Jedi is able to exercise their entirely non-coercive and therefore entirely beneficent influence on individuals and even on whole societies. Or, to be more accurate, it is because they have purged themselves of selfness that the Force is able to use them as a channel of grace and power. I live, not yet I, but the Force lives in me. True of the Jedi, this must be a fortiori, be true of the Avatar, or incarnation of the Force. If, insofar as he was a Jedi, St. Paul was not I, then certainly Christ was not I. And to talk, as so many liberal churchmen now do, of worshipping the personality of Jesus is an absurdity. For, obviously, had Jesus remained content merely to have a personality like the rest of us, he would have never exercised the kind of influence which in fact he did exercise, and it would never have occurred to anyone to regard him as a divine incarnation and to identify him with the Force. That he came to be thought of as the Christ was due to the fact that he had passed beyond selfness and had become the physical and mental conduit through which a more than personal, divine life flowed down into the world. Psyches, which have come into the unit of knowledge of the Force, are, in Bennett of Canfield's phrase, almost nothing in themselves and all in the Force. This vanishing residue of selfness persists because in some slight measure they still identify their being with some innate psychophysical idiosyncrasy, some acquired habit of thought or feeling, some convention or unanalyzed prejudice current in the social environment. Jesus was almost wholly absorbed in the essential will of the Force, but in spite of this, he may have retained some elements of selfness. To what extent there was any I associated with the more than personal divine not I, it is very difficult, on the basis of the existing evidence, to judge. For example, did Jesus interpret his experience of divine reality and his own spontaneous inferences from that experience in terms of those fascinating apocalyptic notions current in the contemporary Jewish circles? Some eminent scholars have argued that the doctrine of the world's imminent dissolution was the central core of his teaching. Others, equally learned, have held that it was attributed to him by the authors of the Synoptic Gospels, and that Jesus himself did not identify his experience and his theological thinking with locally popular opinions. Which party is right? Goodness knows. On this subject, as on so many others, the existing evidence does not permit a certain and unambiguous answer. The moral of all this is plain. The quantity and quality of the surviving biographical documents are such that we have no means of knowing what the residual personality of Jesus was really like. But if the Gospels tell us very little about the I, which was Jesus, they make up for this deficiency by telling us inferentially, in the parables and discourses, a good deal about the spiritual not I, whose manifest presence in the mortal man was the reason why his disciples called him the Christ and identified him with the eternal force.
Quote.
When goodness grows weak, when evil increases, I make myself a body. In every age I come back to deliver the holy, to destroy the sin of the sinner, to establish righteousness. They who know the nature of my task and my holy birth is not reborn. When they leave their body, they come to me. Flying from fear, from lust and anger, they hide in me, their refuge and safety. Burnt clean in the blaze of my being, in me many find home. Bhagavad Gita. Then the Blessed One spoke and said, Know, Vaseta, that from time to time an avatar is born into the world, a fully enlightened one, blessed and worthy, abounding in wisdom and goodness, happy with knowledge of the worlds, unsurpassed as a guide to erring mortals, a teacher of gods and men, a blessed Buddha. They thoroughly understand this universe as though they saw it face to face. The truth do they proclaim, both in its letter and its spirit, lovely in its origin, lovely in its progress, lovely in its consummation. A higher life is made known in all its purity and all its perfectness. Triviga Sutta.
End quote.
The biography of a Jedi, or avatar, is valuable only insofar as it throws light upon the means by which, in the circumstances of a particular human life, the I was purged away so as to make room for the divine not I. The authors of the Synoptic Gospels did not choose to write such a biography, and no amount of textual criticism or ingenious surmise can call it into existence. In the course of the last 100 years, an enormous sum of energy has been expanded on the attempt to make documents yield more evidence than they in fact contain. However regrettable may be the synoptists' lack of interest in biography, and whatever objections may be raised against the theologies of Paul or John, there can still be no doubt that their instinct was essentially sound. Each, in his own way, wrote about the eternal not I of Christ, rather than the historical I. Each, in his own way, stressed that element in the life of Jesus in which, because it is more than personal, all persons can participate. The nature of selfness is such that one person cannot be a part of another person. A self can contain or be contained by something that is either less or more than a self. It can never contain or be contained by a self. The doctrine that the Force can be incarnated in human form is found in most of the principal historic expositions of the perennial philosophy of the Jedi. In Hinduism, in Mahayana Buddhism, in Christianity, and in the Islam of the Sufis, by whom the Prophet was equated with the eternal Force. Krishna is an incarnation of Brahman, Gautama Buddha of what the Mahayanists call the Dharmakaya, suchness, mind, and the spiritual ground of all being. The Christian doctrine of the incarnation of the unmanifest force in human form differs from that of India and the Far East, inasmuch as it affirms there has been and can be only one avatar. What we do depends in large measure upon what we think, and if what we do is evil, there is good empirical reason for supposing that our thought patterns are inadequate to material, mental, or spiritual reality. Because Christians believed that there had been only one avatar, Christian history has been disgraced by more and bloodier crusades, interdenominational wars, persecutions, and proselytizing imperialism than has the history of Hinduism and Buddhism. Absurd and idolatrous doctrines, affirming the quasi-defined nature of sovereign states and their rulers, have led Oriental, no less than Western peoples into innumerable political wars. But because they have not believed in an exclusive revelation at one sole instant of time, or in the quasi-divinity of an ecclesiastical organisation, Oriental peoples have kept remarkably clear of the mass murder for religion's sake, which is so dreadfully frequent in Christendom. And while, in this important respect, the level of public morality has been lower in the West than in the East, the levels of exceptional sanctity and of ordinary individual morality have not, so far as one can judge from the available evidence, been any higher. If the tree is indeed known by its fruits, Christianity's departure from the norm of the perennial philosophy of the Jedi would seem to be philosophically unjustifiable. The Force passes out of eternity into time for no other purpose than to assist the beings whose bodily form it takes to pass out of time and into eternity. If the Avatar's appearance upon the stage of history is enormously important, this is due to the fact that by their teaching they point out, and by their being a channel of grace and divine power they actually are, the means by which human beings may transcend the limitations of history. The author of the Fourth Gospel affirms that the Force became flesh, but in another passage they add that the flesh profits nothing, that is to say, in itself, but a great deal, of course, as a means to the union with the immanent and transcendent Force. In this context, it is very interesting to consider the development of Buddhism. Under the forms of religious or mystical imagery, writes R.E. Johnston in his Buddhist China, the Mahayana expresses the universal, whereas Hinayana cannot set itself free from the denomination of historical fact. In the words of an eminent Orientalist, Ananda K. Kumaraswamy, the Mahayanist believer is warned precisely as the worshipper of Krishna is warned in the Vaishnavita scriptures, that the Krishna Leela is not a history, but a process, forever unfolded in the hearts of people, that matters of historical fact are without religious significance, except, we should add, insofar as they point to or themselves constitute the means, whether remote or proximate, whether political, ethical or spiritual, by which people may come to deliverance from selfness and the temporal order. In the West, the mystics went some way towards liberating Christianity from its unfortunate servitude to historic fact, or, to be more accurate, to those various mixtures of contemporary record with subsequent inference and fantasy, which have at different epochs been accepted as historical fact. From the writings of Eckhart, Tauler and Risebrook, of Bohm, William Law and the Quakers, it should be possible to extract a spiritualized and universalized Christianity, whose narratives should refer not to history as it was, or as someone afterwards thought it ought to be, but to processes forever unfolded in the hearts of people. Unfortunately, the influence of the mystics was never powerful enough to bring about a radical Mahayanist revolution in the West. In spite of them, Christianity has remained a religion in which the pure perennial philosophy of the Jedi has been overlaid, now more, now less, by an idolatrous preoccupation with events and things in time. Events and things regarded not merely as useful means, but as ends, intrinsically sacred and indeed divine. Moreover, such improvements on history as were made in the course of centuries were most imprudently treated as though they themselves were a part of history, a procedure which puts a powerful weapon into the hands of Protestant and later of rationalist controversialists. How much wiser it would have been to admit the perfectly avowable fact that when the sternness of Christ the Judge had been unduly emphasized, men and women felt the need of personifying the divine compassion in a new form, with the result that the figure of the Virgin, mediatrix to the mediator, came into increased prominence. And when, in the course of time, the Queen of Heaven was felt to be too awe-inspiring, compassion was re-personified in the homely figure of St. Joseph, who thus became mediator to the mediatrix to the mediator. In exactly the same way, Buddhist worshippers felt that the historic Sakyamuni, with his insistence on recollectedness, discrimination, and a total dying to self as the principal means of liberation, was too stern and too intellectual. The result was that the love and compassion which Sakyamuni had also inculcated came to be personified in Buddhas such as Amida and Maitreya, divine characters completely removed from history, inasmuch as their temporal career was situated somewhere in the distant past or distant future. Here, it may be remarked that the vast numbers of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, of whom the Mahayanist theologians speak, are commensurate with the vastness of their cosmology. Time for them is beginningless, and the innumerable universes, each one of them supporting sentient beings of every possible variety, are born, evolve, decay, and die, only to repeat the same cycle again and again, until the final inconceivably remote consummation, when every sentient being in all the worlds shall have won deliverance out of time into eternal suchness or Buddhahood. This cosmological background to Buddhism has affinities with the world picture of modern astronomy, especially with that version of it offered in the recently published theory of Dr. Weizsäcker regarding the formation of planets. If the Weizsäcker hypothesis is correct, the production of a planetary system would be a normal episode in the life of almost every star. There are 400 million stars in our own galactic system alone, and beyond our galaxy are other galaxies, indefinitely. If, as we have no choice but to believe, spiritual laws governing consciousness are uniform throughout the whole planet-bearing and presumably life-supporting universe, then certainly there is plenty of room, and at the same time, no doubt, the most agonizing and desperate need for those innumerable, redemptive incarnations of suchness upon whose shining multitudes the Mahayanists love to dwell.
Quote.
For my part, I think the chief reason which prompted the invisible force to become visible in the flesh was to lead carnal people who are only able to love carnally to the healthy love of its flesh, and afterwards, little by little, to spiritual love. Saint Bernard.
End quote.
St. Bernard's doctrine of the carnal love of Christ has been admirably summed up by Professor Etienne Gilson in his book, The Mystical Theology of St. Bernard. Knowledge of self already expanded into social, carnal love of the neighbour, so like oneself in misery, is now a second time expanded into a carnal love of Christ, the model of compassion, since for our salvation he has become the man of sorrows. Here then is the place occupied in Cistercian mysticism by the meditation on the visible humanity of Christ. It is but a beginning, but an absolutely necessary beginning. Charity, of course, is essentially spiritual, and a love of this kind can be no more than its first moment. It is too much bound up with the senses, unless we know how to make use of it with prudence, and to lean on it only as something to be surpassed. In expressing himself thus, Bernard merely codified the teaching of his own experience, for we have it from him that he was much given to the practice of this sensitive love at the outset of his conversion. Later on, he was to consider it an advance to have passed beyond it, not, that is to say, to have forgotten it, but to have added another, which outweighs it as the rational and spiritual outweigh the carnal. Nevertheless, this beginning is already a summit. This sensitive affection for Christ was always presented by St. Bernard as love of a relatively inferior order. It is so precisely on account of its sensitive character, for charity is of a purely spiritual essence. In right, the psyche should be able to enter directly into union, in virtue of its spiritual powers, with the force which is pure spirit. The Incarnation, moreover, should be regarded as one of the consequences of man's transgression, so that love for the person of Christ is, as a matter of fact, bound up with the history of a fall which need not and should not have happened. St. Bernard, furthermore, and in several places, notes that this affection cannot stand safely alone, but needs to be supported by what he calls science. He had examples before him of the deviations into which even the most ardent devotion can fall, when it is not allied with and ruled by a sane theology. Can the many fantastic and mutually incompatible theories of expiation and atonement, which have been grafted onto the Christian doctrine of divine incarnation, be regarded as indispensable elements of a sane theology? I find it difficult to imagine how anyone who has looked into a history of these notions, as expounded, for example, by the author of the Epistle to the Hebrews, by Athanasius and Augustine, by Anselm and Luther, by Calvin and Grotius, can plausibly answer this question in the affirmative. In the present context, it will be enough to call attention to one of the bitterest of all the bitter ironies of history. For the Christ of the Gospels, lawyers seemed further from the kingdom of heaven, more hopelessly impervious to reality than almost any other class of human beings, except the rich. But Christian theology, especially that of the Western churches, was the product of minds imbued with Jewish and Roman legalism. In all too many instances, the immediate insights of the avatar and the theocentric saint were rationalized into a system, not by philosophers, but by speculative barristers and metaphysical jurists. Why should what Abbot John Chapman calls the problem of reconciling, not even uniting, mysticism and Christianity be so extremely difficult? Simply because so much Roman and Protestant thinking was done by those very lawyers whom Christ regarded as being peculiarly incapable of understanding the true nature of things. The abbot, Chapman is apparently referring to Abbot Marmion, says St. John of the Cross is like a sponge full of Christianity. You can squeeze it all out, and the full mystical theory, in other words, the pure perennial philosophy of the Jedi, remains. Consequently, for 15 years or so, I hated St. John of the Cross and called him a Buddhist. I loved St. Teresa and read her over and over again. She is first a Christian, only secondarily a mystic. Then I found I had wasted 15 years so far as prayer was concerned.
Quote.
Now see the meaning of these two sayings of Christ's. The one, no man cometh unto the Father but by me, that is, through my life. The other saying, no man cometh unto me, except the Father draw him. That is, he does not take my life upon him and follow after me, except he is moved and drawn of my Father, that is, of the simple and perfect good, of which St. Paul said, when that which is perfect is come, that which is in part shall be done away. Theologia Germanica.
End quote.
In other words, there must be imitation of Christ before there can be identification with the Father. And there must be essential identity or likeness between the human spirit and the force, which is spirit, in order that the idea of imitating the earthly behaviour of the incarnate unmanifest force should ever cross anybody's mind. Christian theologians speak of the possibility of deification, but deny that there is identity of substance between spiritual reality and the human spirit. In Vedanta and Mahayana Buddhism, as also among the Sufis, spirit and spirit are held to be the same substance. Atman is Brahman. That art thou. The Jedi is one with the Force.
Quote.
When not enlightened, Buddhas are no other than ordinary beings. When there is enlightenment, ordinary beings at once turn into Buddhas. Hidden.
End quote.
Every human being can thus become an avatar by adoption, but not by their unaided efforts. They must be shown the way, and they must be aided by divine grace. That men and women may be thus instructed and helped, the unmanifest force assumes the form of an ordinary human being who has to earn deliverance and enlightenment in the way that it is prescribed by the divine nature of things, namely, by charity, by a total dying to self, and a total, one-pointed awareness. Thus enlightened, the avatar can reveal the way of enlightenment to others and help them to actually become what they already potentially are. Tel qu'en lui-même enfant l'éternité le change, just as eternity changes him in himself. And, of course, the eternity which transforms us into ourselves is not the experience of mere persistence after bodily death. There will be no experience of timeless reality then, unless there is the same or a similar knowledge within the world of time and matter. By precept and by example, the avatar teaches that this transforming knowledge is possible, that all sentient beings are called to it, and that, sooner or later, in one way or another, all must finally come to it.